Welcome to God Talk from your Chaplaincy at CCCU. This week we are pleased to introduce Ruth Harley. Ruth is an ordinand in Birmingham and is attending the Queen's Foundation for the Ecumenical Theological Education. She has recently co-authored with Al Barrett, Being Interrupted, Reimaging the Church Mission from the Outside In.
Well, let's welcome everybody who's here, and a special welcome to Ruth Harley, who's joining us today. Thank you ever so much for giving up your time. So to begin with, I'm going to ask Ruth a few questions. We're going to find out a bit about her and some of her theological thinking, and then we'll open it up to a broader conversation. So that's our basic plan. So Ruth, just to explain where you are at the moment and why we're seeing lots of books and things behind you.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be with you. So I am at the moment in Birmingham. I am at the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Theological Education, which is a bit of a mouthful, which is a theological college which trains students for ministry in the Church of England and in the Methodist Church and in a number of other denominations, and also has independent students and research students. It's also the home of the Centre for Black Theology. And I'm coming to you from my flat at the Queen's Foundation, where I am training to be a priest in the Church of England. Hence some of the books, although some of them are for fun as well.
That's good, that's good. And you're from Kent, is that right?
I am, yes. So I was born in Margate and I grew up in Deal, went to school in Dover, and I've still got family, so I pop down there from time to time. Yeah, and it's very nice to be virtually back in Kent, as it were.
well, I was going to say a warm virtual welcome to a cold and rainy day in Kent. Now, the very exciting thing is you're about to have a book published entitled Being Interrupted. That's the key thing. And then it has what I find a really intriguing subtitle about mission from the outside in. That sounds really interesting. And I know you've been thinking about unexpected encounters with God. So could you give us an example, perhaps give us a biblical example to begin with, of what an unexpected encounter might be?
Sure. So I think the Bible is full of unexpected encounters with God. In fact, I think you could probably quite easily count the number of expected encounters with God. I think most encounters in the Bible are in some way unexpected. An example would be when Jacob encounters God at the ford at Jabbok, when he wrestles with, well, is it an angel, is it God? But he wrestles all night and he walks away limping but blessed. And I love that encounter because of the way the dialogue works in it. So every time Jacob asks a question, God seems to answer a different question. So when Jacob asks, "Who are you?" he doesn't get the answer to "Who are you?" He gets the answer to a completely different question. And when he asks for a blessing, then he gets, again, an answer that isn't the answer he's asking for. And I love that because I think that certainly reflects a lot of my own experience of encountering God, that the answer you get is not always the answer to the question you thought you were asking. And that my experience is that I have been changed by God in unexpected ways, the way Jacob is changed. And Jacob leaves that encounter limping. And I think that's really interesting. The idea of encounter with God changing us in ways that aren't straightforwardly better, for want of a better word, but changing us in ways that will affect us in the future, ways that we carry with us, that aren't always straightforward. So I love that encounter. And I think my New Testament example, because I'll give one of each, one of my favourite unexpected encounters with Jesus is when Jesus encounters the woman at the well. And I love that for the way it's unexpected for her. She's not expecting to encounter Jesus. And I love her absolute incredulity in the way she approaches him with her, but you haven't even got a bucket. How are you going to give us some water? But also it's an unexpected encounter for the disciples. When the disciples come back and see Jesus having a conversation with this woman who ought to be, if you'll pardon the pun, beyond the pale, that's unexpected for them as well. And they encounter something that maybe they haven't seen before, by encountering God in a conversation between Jesus and somebody who they would not have thought to look for God with. But the Bible is absolutely full of unexpected encounters with God, either encounters where somebody isn't expecting to meet God at all, or encounters where they are approaching God deliberately, but get a very different outcome or response from what they were expecting. And I love that. I think that's one of the real riches of scripture for me, is that those encounters, you can't just look at them and go, oh, well, we know what that means and what that tells us. You have to dig deeper. You get invited into the story to engage with it more.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a great examples, very clear about what you mean by unexpected. So you alluded to the fact that your own story is a story with unexpected encounters. Could you sort of describe one of those for us, and what happened and what it was like? How did you know it was God?
Sure, that's a really good question. How did you know it was God? Yeah. And I think my first answer to that bit of the question would be usually only with hindsight. I'm terribly bad, as I think many of us are, at noticing God at the time. I very often think, oh, wait, that back there, that was an encounter with God. But I think maybe that's just how humans engage with God sometimes, is it takes us a little while to catch up, and that's okay. So one of the areas in which I have encountered God in ways I really never expected to is among children and young people, teenagers, young adults, but particularly younger children, actually. So before I was here training for ordination, I was a children's and youth worker in a parish church for quite a long time, which is something I never expected to do, but that's perhaps a story for another day. And I encountered God all the time in the children and young people who I worked with. I think adults very often perceive that flow as one way, that we as adults mediate something about God to the children in our care, particularly in a church setting. And that wasn't my experience at all. It was very much that was a mutual encounter in which God was present, and I learned something about who God was. I used to do some work in a special school there, a school for children and young people with emotional and behavioural problems, as well as special educational needs. And that was somewhere I encountered God an awful lot in the most unexpected ways. In the young people, but also in the grace and the generosity and the compassion and the willingness to just keep loving and keep trying again that the staff exhibited there. It wasn't a Christian setting at all. And yet I don't know that I've ever been anywhere that felt so much like I think God feels. I used to walk in through the door there and want to just start my day by saying, the kingdom of heaven is like this. And I guess that's why Jesus taught in parables, because it enables you to bring those unexpected encounters and unexpected dimensions together. So that's one of my arenas of unexpected encounter, I suppose. But another one that I think is really crucial, that's quite a nice sort of happy, how lovely that I encountered that kind of an answer. But another one I think is really crucial, particularly at the moment, is around encountering God in uncertainty. I think it's a great mistake to think that faith means we've got it all sorted and we know all the answers. I think any person of faith can tell you that's not the case. That's not how life pans out for any of us, really. And I forget who it is who said that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And I love that, because if you're certain, you don't need faith. And I think meeting God in uncertainty has been really important to me. That happened to me really strongly when I was at university, actually. When I was at university, I became quite suddenly and unexpectedly ill. And I had to take a year out. And at the time, it was extremely traumatic and difficult. And somehow in it was God. Not in a it's all going to be okay sort of a way. And very evidently not in a things aren't ever going to go wrong for you kind of a way, because things had gone wrong, and it wasn't at all clear that it was going to be okay. But somehow God was in that. And I guess I've made more sense of that since. I've been really influenced by theologians who do work around finding God in darkness or in silence. So Barbara Brown Taylor is one of those theologians who I would recommend to anyone. She's written 2 excellent books about it. One is called Learning to Walk in the Dark, and the other one is a really tiny, short little book, a really quick read, called When God is Silent. And that's an extraordinary book. It's about, partly inspired by her experience of leaving parish ministry in quite difficult circumstances. And I think what she has to say, drawing often on some of the church fathers and mothers and earlier theologians, what she has to say about God not necessarily being experienced as a light or as a presence or as a word, but also being experienced as a darkness or as a silence or even as an absence. I find that really fascinating.
Mm. So can you say a little bit more about this year, this sort of interrupted year when you found yourself ill? How would you describe God encountering you there? Can you give us a sense of what that felt like, how it happened?
Yeah, it's quite hard to describe, actually, as I think encounters with God often are quite hard to describe, and maybe that's one of the ways you sometimes know it is God, because you know it but you can't say it. But I remember realising that I was going to have to take this year out, which I really didn't want to do, and going into my college chapel, which I spent a lot of time in and felt very at home in, and just crying because it was so overwhelmingly, I didn't know what I was going to do, and I really felt quite despairing. And then this sort of sense, not of reassurance or of this is okay, but a sort somehow, not even peace actually, I suppose a sense of peace, but sense of something beyond me, that sort of sense of being held by something more, a kind of something that I recognise in writings about contemplation being something that centres you in yourself and in God, that sort of sense of centeredness and being held that isn't dependent on what happens next.
Yeah.
I'd love to say, actually, I don't know that I would love to say. Part of me would love to say, oh yes, I knew it would all be okay because God was there with me. But that wouldn't be an honest reflection of my experience. And I think telling stories that way sells people short and sometimes sets people up with a false expectation of.
Oh, I think Ruth is frozen.
Ruth has quite weak internet where she is, but hopefully she'll be back with us shortly.
Okay.
I think I'm back with you.
You're back.
Do you think I'm back with you?
Yes.
Hooray!
Thank you ever so much, because that it is, as you say, it's extremely difficult, and thank you for sharing something that's, you know, really personal. You made that very clear, what that sense is that can't quite be categorized in the usual ways. And I absolutely agree with you about the sort of glib, triumphalistic versions, caricatures of what it means to live a Christian life, which don't prepare anybody for some of the realities. Yeah. So you've given us a couple of very clear biblical examples of Jacob and the woman at the well, and you've also given us a very powerful example of your own, I mean, literal kind of interruption of study. So what I'm intrigued now is how is that sense of a God who interrupts and meets us unexpectedly, how is that related to this language of mission? And mission from the outside in?
Yeah, so the book that I've co-written with my co-author Al Barrett, who is a vicar here in Birmingham, it's called Being Interrupted, Reimaging the Church's Mission from the Outside In. And the being interrupted bit of the title, I suppose, speaks to my experience and Al's experience of meeting God in places that the church has not taught us that we would meet God. And what that has made us think and question about how mission works as a concept. And one of the things that we look at, to get briefly, hopefully not too technical, but you do need a bit of it, is what we call missional economies. So in some models of church, you get this idea of an outward flow, and in some models of church, you get more of an inward flow. So an inward flow economy would be, this is a simplistic caricature, but would be, we need to get as many bums on pews on a Sunday morning as we can. That's the aim. And sometimes there's also a financial dimension to that. We need to be getting financial resources in. And so the purpose of mission is to go out in order to get people and possibly money in. And with really good reasons. You know, that's often attached with a model of salvation where belonging to church and salvation are very tied up together. That's not necessarily a selfish kind of an aim for a church to have. It can be very tied up with all sorts of aspects of theology. And then you get an outward missional economy, which you find in a lot of more liberal churches, where the purpose of mission is for us to go out and to give something. So it might be that something might be an evangelistic sort of a something in the sense of sharing the good news, but it might equally be the purpose of our mission is to go out and feed people, to go out and help people who are homeless, all of which are good things to be doing. I think we would want to be very clear about that. But what we're wanting to say is that in both of these economies, something is not quite right about the balance of power between the us, and that's a big thing to examine, who is us in this context, but let's say us who call ourselves the church. I think the sort of relationship challenges of the first economy are perhaps more obvious. You know, if you are approaching people with the purpose of drawing them in, there's a certain amount of instrumentalizing of them and you. The second economy, I think it's a lot less obvious, but what we're wanting to say is there are also temptations which distort our relationship with our neighbour in that economy. So we talk about those quite a lot.
I'm sure Ruth will be back.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I lost you again for a moment there. One of the challenges of that giving economy is that it can set up us, the ones doing the church, as an active agent and as useful, being our primary sort of something, and our neighbour, to whom we are doing or giving, as passive, recipient, and in some sense needy. And actually, by defining human beings as needy versus useful, that's profoundly distorting of the actual relationship that neighbours have with each other. So what we talk about in Being Interrupted is a third economy, missional economy, which we're not saying is the answer. We're saying is perhaps the corrective towards some of those tendencies in the first two economies, which is a receptive economy of mission. So that is going out, because mission is always about going out. I think it's always about being sent in some sense, but going out with what we often say, with open hands and with open hearts, going out to listen to where God already is and to encounter God in our neighbours, without a presupposition of who they are or who we need to be for them, or whether we need to be anything for them, who they might be for us. But going out ready and attentive to find what of God we can encounter in our neighbours, what gifts there are already in our community. It's a missional commitment, but it's also a political commitment, and it's closely linked with something called asset-based community development, which is an approach used in a lot of community work or in more materially deprived neighbourhoods, of taking an approach of looking not for the deprivations and the lacks, but looking for the assets that exist within a community in terms of relationship and in terms of skills and time and network and all those other harder to quantify things. So that's the interruption. So going out in an open-handed, open-hearted way that is open to interruption, that is saying always, what I think about this context is provisional and is highly subjective from my perspective, and that I need to be open to hear God and to receive something of God from the people I encounter. I think that would be a fair summary. There has obviously turned out to be quite a large irony in writing a book called Being Interrupted, just at the moment, because we'd nearly finished writing it when the pandemic hit, at which point we had to send an email to our publisher saying, yes, you know that book called Being Interrupted? Well, we've been interrupted. Which has also been a very interesting experience in all sorts of ways. And one of the lenses through which we're looking at that way of being interrupted is talking about sort of some of the aspects of dominant culture within the church, which still is very white, very male, very middle class. And so we are using those three lenses of race, class, and gender to ask some questions about the church's privilege and the church's obliviousnesses, and how opening ourselves to the interrupting of those privileges and those assumptions can be really life-giving for the church as a whole.
Okay, that again, that's very, very, very clear. I want to come back to the gender question in a moment, but I did some work fairly recently with two others, interviewing university chaplains all across Britain, and asking them to describe the kinds of things they're doing. And a word which is used very, very often is the word presence. So if you ask university chaplains what are they about, they'll often describe themselves not necessarily as putting on a huge great show they want to invite people to, nor as kind of obviously going out with resources to meet, so we're experts in helping people with difficulties in pedagogy. But they'll talk about presence or being there. They'll talk about just sitting, being, observing, watching, talking, listening, looking, learning. Does that? It sounds to me like that would chime very much with what you're talking about. Do you think there's a synergy there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we in parish ministry have a huge amount to learn from you in chaplaincy about that kind of commitment to presence. And I also think, I mean, you would know more about this than me, but that perhaps chaplaincy is one of those edge spaces. We talk a lot in our work in the community that we work in about bumping spaces where people can have unagendered encounters with each other. And another metaphor that we use is talking about ecotones, which is a word that we've borrowed from ecology. And an ecotone, I'm hoping there's not too many ecologists on the call who will correct me on this, but please do if you're here. An ecotone is where two habitats meet. So it could be the shoreline or it could be the edge of a woodland, but it's an environment in itself. And one of the things that we are thinking about a lot is about mission as something. What does it mean to be missional in an ecotone? What does it mean to view the space where our community meets our church, or the space where different bits of our community engage with each other? Not as, as something in its own right that is itself, that the meeting space, the edge space, the bumping space is in itself somewhere that we encounter God, often in very unexpected ways, I think.
Yeah. Let me come back to the gender issue, because the Church of England, as I often encounter it, on the ground, lived reality. Who's there? Who's doing the work? Who's keeping the show on the road? I mean, it's massively female.
Yep.
And in the sort of, in this, to use the kind of ecological language, and in the sort of little ecological niches of the parish or the place, without faithful women of all ages, the thing would utterly collapse. And that's juxtaposed with a sort of a historical but shifting slowly male hierarchy. But I can't quite explain it, but there's a sort of there's a disequilibrium between the kind of reality of what's lived and people empowered on the ground, and a kind of sort of semi-reluctant power sharing with women who are sort of expected to conform with an inherited pattern of power distribution. That's how it kind of looks. But I'm very interested in how it. I mean, what if that's a correct sketch? What do we do with it? How do we get men empowered at one level, and how do we get women able to use their God-given way of being persons for the benefit of all?
Yeah, I think that's a massive question. I think everything you've just described, I completely recognise. Absolutely. Another way of phrasing that would be, and here I will nail my colours to the mast as a committed feminist theologian, another way of phrasing that would be that the patriarchal institution of the church depends, and has always depended, on the unpaid labour of women, like most other patriarchal institutions in society. And it still does. And when you look at clergy deployment, the vast majority of senior roles are inhabited by men still, and the vast majority of unpaid ordained ministry and the vast majority of unpaid lay ministry is still inhabited by women. And there's no quick fix, I don't think. I think it's such a huge issue. And for me, I think there's only so far we can get with specific questions about things like women's ordination, which is a question that's largely been dealt with now in the Church of England, but, you know, not entirely. Or questions about how we get more women in senior leadership roles. Those are interesting questions, but they're only interesting to me as part of a bigger question about the nature of the church. And this is where I think looking at gender in relation to things like race and class, but also other systems of privilege and oppression, is really, really important, because as well as a patriarchal structure, we have a post-Christendom church, which is a colonialist structure. The church is racist, and the church is colonialist, and the church is classist. It's a very middle class structure. And until we can start looking at all of those things together, as well as the churches, you know, those are the things that we particularly look at in Being Interrupted, but we could equally have looked at the church as an ableist institution and a homophobic institution and a transphobic institution, and there's a lot of dimensions to this. And I think a lot of it for me comes from an unwillingness to be interrupted. I think there's a real sense within church hierarchies, but also within the church as a whole, that stability is good and keeping the show on the road is good. And we've seen that reflected in a lot of the responses during the pandemic. And anything that threatens that is bad. And I just don't see that in scripture or tradition, frankly. I think we need to embrace something. I've been reading a fantastic book lately by Rachel Mann called Love's Mysteries. It's her latest one, which is about, she talks a lot about precarity and the idea that the church as the body of Christ is and should be precarious. And that feels so far from how the Church of England exists at the moment. But I do think the church at its best and at its most visionary and at its most prophetic, that's when we can acknowledge our shared precarity and drop the front that says, it's going to be okay, we've got this under control, we can keep the show on the road for another however long. And I think some of the ways that the church is being forced into a greater degree of precarity, so some dioceses are really feeling the financial pinch now, and that is making that precarity more obvious. Some dioceses are in recruitment crisis, and that's making that precarity more obvious. Lots of churches have got steeply declining numbers, and that's making that precarity more obvious. I don't know that I think any of those things are bad things. I think there's a risk that we idolize growth, and I mean that in the serious sense of idolatry as worshipping something that isn't God. That we idolize growth and we say continual growth is possible, and yet when we look around us at what God has created, continuous growth is not possible. I'm looking out of the window at the tree in front of my desk, and it is very big, and I expect it is growing, but there are dead bits all over the floor underneath it, and there's a whole ecosystem down there that is supporting new life. And I think one of the things that we as church need to really work at, and it's really hard, is embracing a sense of precarity that then creates space for the people who have always known that precarity. So I think the people in church structures who are most resistant to understanding themselves as precarious are, in my experience, straight, white, able-bodied, middle-class men in senior roles. Because with precarity, they have everything to lose, and they can't see that they have anything to gain, although I would say they do. But actually, I think the whole church would gain from understanding ourselves as precarious, and understanding something really profound about death and resurrection. I think continual growth as a metaphor is not compatible with death and resurrection as a metaphor. And if we're going to pick one, I want to go with death and resurrection.
And I absolutely agree. I'm slightly in trouble for having put in print that the current mission strategy of the Church of England is effectively neoliberalism, but that's another matter. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, yes.
One final question, then I must be less selfish and hand over to other people. Our conversation so far, we've talked a lot about, if you like, the phenomenon of how God shows up, or what the church might feel like, or what mission might feel like. What, on the basis of that, can I ask you what notion of God lies behind that? If this is the way God shows up in the world, then who is God? What is God? What is God's being and nature that this should be how God manifests and works?
That's a fantastic question. And I'm not going to say, well, this is what God must be like for this to happen, because I think that's kind of a whole point, is that we can't say that. And I think that one of the things that would really help the church in discovering a wider experience of God and a wider and perhaps more precarious understanding of God is using a wider variety of language about God. All language for God is metaphorical. I'm taking that as a given. We can't ever say that is who God is. And God's self does not say that is who God is. God says, I am. I am. And the narrower our set of metaphors for God, the narrower our set of names and language for God and our understanding of God, the narrower our understanding of ourselves in relation to God becomes. And that's why, as a feminist theologian, I'm very committed to broadening our words for God in liturgical contexts as well as other contexts. So if we always, there's nothing wrong with calling God Father. There's nothing wrong with calling God Lord or King. But if those are the only words we've got for God, if we can't also call God Mother, and if we can't also call God Rock, and if we can't also call God Life Giver and Justice, and if we can't deploy a whole range of metaphors for God, then we're missing out on something, I think. So I guess my answer to who then is the God who shows up like this is both all of those things and all the words we can think of for God, and also none of them, because none of them are actually enough to get at who God is. A theologian who I very much admire and am lucky enough to be taught by here, Rachel Starr, describes God as the breathing space. And I love that. I mean, that's not it either, because no language is. But I love that because there's so many dimensions to it. God as the breathing space, God as a pause, that can encompass God as silence, perhaps. It's God, and breath is something life-giving. It's God as the pause we need in order to live. I think poetry and imagery and metaphor has a huge amount to offer us about who God is, as long as we remember it's never the end of the conversation. That's a slightly convoluted answer to your question.
No, thank you for being prepared to have a go at it. There's space to breathe, pause. Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Right, so this is the turn of anyone would like to put a question to Ruth. Please do so. Andrew, you've unmuted. That's encouraging.
I can just see Dave smiling there because he knows I have a number of I've been writing down a list.
Excellent.
The first thing, it's all in different parts of your talk, actually. So the first thing I wanted to say was the dark night of the soul is a really good way of understanding that encounter or absent encounter with God. And I always find that the dark night of the soul is never really given enough credit. You look at figures like Mother Teresa, who went through the dark night of the soul for, I think, 23 years, near the end of her life. Her entire public ministry really was in that period, and she did amazing things, still believing and following that vocation God had called her to. The second point I had down was I always find when we talk about the equality of genders a really difficult subject, because I think there's a difficulty around appointment equality. So when we had that period in the Church of England where they first started making female bishops, we had a lot of people who were appointed based on their gender rather than their qualifications. And I find that's a sort of sticky area that the church has got itself into, where it sort of hasn't really thought the plan through properly around how we do things equally. There's a big push to get as many female bishops out there as possible, without actually thinking the greater impact on them as well, because we have female bishops in dioceses that are very much anti-women, and it sort of puts a great strain on them. You just need to look at the Bishop of London, who has, I think, a third of her area is anti-women, and it's sort of, well, was that necessarily thought through? How do we actually give them the ability to lead in that area and support them through it? There's no sort of support structure in place for those kind of appointments. And then the next point I had was a coined phrase from Bishop Nick in Salisbury, was the agenda of disruption. So always being on the agenda of disruption to bring about change and forcing the church on a wider scale to diversify its portfolio. And I had that conversation with the Archdeacon last week about buying a pub, trying to encourage the church to put its money where its mouth is, really, and help us get back into the community by running a church pub, which he did say he would take to the wider meetings, but I highly doubt I'm getting my pub. So I don't know if I've actually asked any questions, just thrown a lot of ideas into that sort of conversation.
No, those are fantastic. There's some real richness there, and I hadn't come across that phrase "agenda of disruption" from Bishop Nick before. So thank you for that. That's definitely where we're at. So really helpful. Yeah, I think that thing about the dark night of the soul is a really important one. I think sometimes people hear that phrase. I have to say, people who've not read who've not read the book generally, and think of it as some sort of heroic struggle that you then come out of the other side of. And I must admit that was probably my perception for a while. And my experience, less in a sort of crisis-y way, but more, my experience has been that the dark night of the soul is often quite long and boring. I think that's an unexpected dimension of encounter with God that we maybe don't talk about enough, but it's not always very interesting or exciting. Sometimes it's just keeping on, and that's also okay, and God is in that.
That's what
I think that's a really important dimension.
That's what I find the most interesting about Mother Teresa, was she went through that very long period of her life still following that vocation, that original calling, but entirely not sure if God was there supporting it or anything. And if you read some of the letters to her spiritual director, they are very painful letters, full of anguish and full of suffering, with no answer from God. It's a really, really powerful book, actually, the one on her letters.
Yeah, and I think that's a narrative we need, because I think in a well-meaning drive to encourage more vocations, as if that's possible, because we all have a vocation, I think the Church of England has sometimes set up particular narratives around vocation, which aren't always the most helpful narratives. And then for those of us whose experience of vocation falls outside of those narratives, it becomes hard to articulate our own sense of vocation. So certainly for me, I have had phases of my life where I have encountered God in really exciting and overwhelming ways, and those have not been the phases of life where it would have been a good idea for me to be committing myself to any kind of vocation. And actually what I've needed to understand is the kind of long hard slog of it. And also I think one of the other really important bits for me, this is slightly as a tangent to your previous point, but around vocation, it's the sort of the idea of choice or lack of choice. And obviously that's a bit different for someone like Mother Teresa, who's committed herself very clearly to something. That my spiritual director is a Roman Catholic nun, a Roman Catholic sister, and she's very big on choice. And she tells me about how when she was deciding whether or not to become a Roman Catholic sister, which is obviously a massive lifelong commitment, she kept asking God, well, which should I do? You know, should I be a sister or should I not? And eventually the answer she felt she had from God was, it doesn't matter. You can choose. That God's purpose for her was to be herself and to be in faithful relationship with God. And beyond that, she could choose. And I found that immensely helpful when I was in the discernment process for ordained ministry in the Church of England. And actually, I needed to reach that point of feeling that I could choose. I think a lot of the narratives we have are either around, I felt really called by God and it was really exciting, and so I went for it. Or around, I thought God was calling me, but then I thought God couldn't possibly be, but then I sort of tried to run away from it, but I couldn't. And I think for women, that latter narrative is by far the more common one. And I don't like it. I respect that is some people's experience, but I think as an overall narrative, it's that's not how I recognise God. I don't think God operates in that kind of slightly coercive way. And for me, I needed to reach a point where I could say, I didn't think this was for me. And then some encounters that I've had with God have convinced me that it might be. And then I realised I could have a choice. You know, I don't have to do this.
In that paradigm, then the entire batch system and appointment system needs to be completely reassessed. Because I can see a lot of nodding heads. This is, I'll get on my soapbox if I keep down this road, but the entire process does need reassessing and is too old-fashioned. It goes down those two pathways and doesn't allow for anything in between or even outside of those pathways.
Yeah. I think a lot of nuance gets lost, doesn't it, in the system at every level. And actually, I think that links in really well with your comments about gender equality and bishops and all those sorts of things, which I completely hear. And sort of the impact of that. So one of the places that I read around gender and hierarchy and church is among Roman Catholic feminist theologians. So Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza is a favourite of mine, but there are many who are not overly concerned with women's ordination other than as an outworking of a wider feminist agenda. And are quite critical of churches like ours, which have ordained women, but it hasn't actually made that much difference to the prevailing culture of the hierarchy. And I think it hasn't made as much difference as maybe some people thought it would, either hoped it would or feared it would. And I think, you know, that's a reflection of how strong the overarching patriarchal drive of the church as it is can be. And it functions, it's kind of circular. You know, women who can fit into that paradigm are more likely to be appointed to senior roles, but also when they get there are likely to find that it's extremely hard to shift. Yeah, I think there's some really big questions there.
We're into the last couple of minutes or so of our normal time. So someone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question or make a comment, now is your big chance. Becca and Jane, you look resolutely muted. Do you want... This is your big chance to unmute.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, chat.
Oh,
hang on.
well spotted. Thanks.
Oh. I'm clicking on the button that says promisingly show conversation. I'm getting there we are. Oh no, I clicked it so many times I then took it off.
Publication date for the book.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that.
Oh,
that's a housekeeping.
That's a house. That's not a question.
Oh, okay.
Ruth, can I say thank you for this afternoon? I found that really, really interesting. And I love the fact you mentioned the irony of writing or publishing this during this period of interruption that we've all received. I think that's been one of the most interesting elements of lockdown, that disruption and interruption of the church, and how it's revealed so much about the Church of England and raised so many questions for us in terms of what do we actually believe. I think the conversation over sacraments and churches being closed and receiving, and the conversation that's happened on social media has revealed a lot of dissent, and really those questions still need answering, and as a church we need to be speaking into those things that we've taken for granted for so long. We've stopped having the conversations about what we actually understand by the sacraments and the Eucharist, and this interruption has given us an opportunity to now reflect back on what has been said, to start saying, okay, we need to start having these conversations properly rather than just in the vacuum of social media, or just allowing the churches to continue not acknowledging what perhaps is going on in the pews.
Sorry, I think I lost you for a moment there, but I think I got the gist of that question.
A celebration of the disruption and interruption.
Oh, I think we've lost her again. It's not just my pastoral touch then.
Hello, I think I'm back with you. Do you think I'm back with you?
We do indeed.
The joy of college internet.
No. Hello. Sorry, I lost you all for a moment there, but I think I got the gist there. I think I got the gist of that question. Am I back with you now?
You are indeed.
Wonderful. And I think David, I was picking up the gist of your question in the bits that I managed to get, being about how the current sort of pandemic situation and the church's response to that has revealed kind of stuff about what we believe. Was that the broad gist?
Really celebrating the fact that by having that interruption, it started to raise more questions than perhaps it would have answered by quiet reflection. You know, we're being challenged by what does it mean to be church, challenged by how we approach the physical church and the Eucharist. So yeah,
right. Yes, I'm there. I've got it. Yes, yeah. No, I think you're right. I think there's a massive challenge, and I have with no particular conclusions, you'll be unsurprised to hear. But I think for me, one of the real tensions that the current situation has brought into focus, well, it's brought into focus loads of tensions, hasn't it? But around the Eucharist and around online presence versus on-site presence, which is a lovely way of putting those two options that I've learned recently. Yeah, there's something for me about wanting to really clearly acknowledge the validity and the faithfulness of expressions of church that take place online, and particularly to acknowledge the expressions of church that have taken place online way before this pandemic. Again. Sorry, I think I lost you for again for a moment now. Just I was admiring Andrew's talk as well.
He's just
there's that tension between wanting to acknowledge the validity and the reality of expressions of church that take place online, particularly those expressions of church which have been online way before this pandemic, and especially many of which are led by and as well as serving people, often people with disabilities, are particularly feel included by those expressions of church, and also are leaders of them and experts in what that kind of church means.
Mm-hmm.
But holding that in tension with my own experience of church as being something profoundly embodied.
Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, the rubber hits the road with that one around the Eucharist. But I think that's a facet of a much, much bigger question. So my own church gathered for communion for the first time the Sunday just gone. That was our first time since March. Because as we thought about what we wanted to do, sort of back when lockdown first started to ease, and meeting became a possibility around July, we committed really early on to some principles around what we felt it meant to be church in our context, some of which were around inclusivity and some of which were around authenticity and being authentically us and authentically church in that context, which meant that it took us this long to reach a point where that felt like an okay thing to do. Which for me, as someone formed and steeped in a deeply Catholic, deeply sacramental tradition, was really challenging. And that's another of these tensions that's been exposed to me, certainly by this situation, is the tension between what's right for me and what's right for the community I serve, and how you hold those tensions. And I think that's part of a broader realization of kind of the interdependence of people, which has always been there, but has been revealed really starkly. It's something we'd already written loads about in Being Interrupted. And then in the light of this current situation, we had to go back and write loads more about it because it just seems so important. Yes. That interdependence, which has always been there, but has always been more obvious from some standpoints than others. I think, yeah, I could say an awful lot more about that, but like we might be launching into more than you'd bargained for there. But I think that, yeah, for me, this current situation, probably it's not so much. I think we hear a lot about how the church has changed in response to the pandemic. And I'd want to say I don't know that the church has changed that much. I mean, outwardly in the way we've done stuff, sure. But in terms of the heart of who and what church is, I don't think the church has changed that much. I think how and what and who the church is has been revealed. There's been some really interesting writing, particularly from some theologians in the States, about this as an apocalyptic time, with apocalypse in its Greek meaning of revelation, revealing, unveiling. That something is being unveiled. And sometimes that is happening in very unexpected ways, and sometimes what is unveiled is itself very unexpected.
Yeah. We must draw to a close, but before we do, when is your book going to be published, and how do we get our hands on it?
So the book is going to be published on the 30th of November. You can get it directly from the publishers, who are SCM Press. They have a website. It is also available from all good bookshops, as they say, I guess is the phrase. Yes.
Excellent. So just in time for Christmas for the person who has everything.
Yes.
That's good. So so Ruth, let us if we all unmute, let's just try applause on. I've never tried this before. Let's try unmuting everybody and applauding. Seems to work, actually. So Ruth, we're deeply in your debt. Thank you ever so much for taking time out and dropping into our group. You've given us a huge amount to think about, and you've done it in a way that's been very, very accessible and engaged with the way our lives are lived these days. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us at God Talk. Please join us again next week when we will be looking at what it means to have a lived faith.